Candidly, there's never been a less attractive time to be a seed investor. Historically, the premium of a late stage valuation to an early stage valuation has been about 20 to 25 times. So like think of that as like early stage valuation 10 million, late stage valuation 200, 250 million.
Hey there, thanks so much for being a paid subscriber for the Clean Techies podcast. Because of your support, we can continue to do what we do. Enjoy the unabridged version of this episode. Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview ClimateTech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Rick Zullo, a co-founder and GP at Equal Ventures, where they are investing in startups that serve to help legacy industries innovate. They take an incredible approach to how they invest by doing deep research in each space before investing. So in other words, they don't find a deal, do some research, and then decide whether or not to write a check. They come up with a thesis, research it, and then find companies solving those specific issues. And in some cases, find companies adjacent and then help them to pivot with new business models or things of that nature. Rick has a really great perspective generally on VC, and it was such a pleasure to have him on. Likely this is one of the most densely value-packed episodes we have done so far. Let us know what you think after listening, and if this is your first time, please follow along by subscribing to the pod and to the Substack. Enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Going well. Excited to be here.
I'm super glad to have you on, Rick. I appreciate you making the time in your evening. I know you've got a late night at the office, but let's kick things off straight away by just give us a quick intro to yourself, who you are, what you're doing, kind of where you came from.
Yep. Name's Rick Zullo. I'm one of the co-founders and general partners at a firm called Equal Ventures that I started back in 2019. We are a early stage venture firm focused on bridging the digital divide. And what that really means is investing in technologies that are digitally transforming the sectors that we focus on. We think that these are the sectors that are the most impactful to human life. It's the social safety net with things like insurance, the energy around us and things like climate, the way that we move things and supply chain, and the way that we buy things in commerce. So, that's the focus of our fund. And, we've been fortunate to have some great LPs to support us on that journey, and fortunate to work with some great founders along the way.
Very nice. And we can get into more of the story in a second, but I'm kind of curious. A lot of people, VC is kind of idealized as like the pinnacle of where you want to reach. So when you were kicking off your career, did you dream that you had one day I want to be a VC, or did you have a very clear goal of getting there? Was that something that you kind of fell into or intentionally went towards?
Yeah, I'll smirk a little bit on that because I think VC seems very idealized until you're in it. Then you have some late nights, and it's less about like podcasts and so forth. And I'm on 10 boards now, and that comes with a lot of things. And I love what I do, but it's definitely a boom and bust profession. So if you're looking to get rich quick, you're better off being an entrepreneur or working as a hedge fund or something else like that. And there's no real thing as work-life balance in this, as you can see, we're a service profession, we're with entrepreneurs 100% of our time. But I am one of those strange people that like I kind of wanted to be in venture capital private equity before I even knew what it was. So when I was in college, it was the mid 2000s. Like, I'm an old guy, and with that, there weren't things like TechCrunch and Crunchbase, and I didn't grow up in kind of tech or startup circles. But this whole concept of being a consultant, but also having equity in the companies that you worked with, was something that really fascinated me. So, I basically figured out what venture capital and private equity were. And I think if you look at the size of those asset classes back then, they're a much, 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 much smaller scale than what they are today. And I went to a school that virtually no one has ever come from in venture capital. I went to University of Richmond for college. I graduated with a dual degree in leadership studies, and economics. And with that, there wasn't a real clear path to venture capital and private equity. Candidly, I had no idea what the difference was between the two, but people told me to go get, either work at a consulting firm or investment bank, go to business school, and then maybe I'd have a shot. And still probably like 99% chance that wasn't going to happen. And, did that, spent 5 years in consulting, probably applied to 400, 500 venture capital and private equity firms along the way, and got rejected by every single one, other than during the height of the clean tech, crisis. Got a couple of job offers that were only rescinded and taken away as Harry Reid pushed away the climate bill. And I remember exactly where I was when they announced that they were moving forward with ACA, and the phone call that I got from the venture firm that had just like given me a verbal offer, 15 minutes later, being like, sorry, your offer is no longer standing. And that was a huge, huge morale hit to me. Like, just to be like, I finally made it to the other side, and I'm going to go get a job at this clean tech venture capital firm. That's exactly what I wanted to do. And then to see that evaporate. So, ended up, going through that journey with Deloitte, and, fortunately I had the chance to work with some venture capital and private equity clients. And, then shortly before business school, came across a private equity firm that was willing to hire me, that happened to work in the tech sector, doing lower middle market buyouts of vertical software companies. And, they helped me go through Columbia Business School. And I was fortunate to work with a couple of internships at First Round Capital and Bowery Capital and Foundation Capital along the way. And then was lucky enough, after waiting an entire summer after business school with no paycheck, while my wife worked at a nonprofit, that I left a paid consulting and private equity, for my consulting firm, willing to sponsor me. And my wife is like, yeah, you just spent $120,000 on business school and you don't have a job. And, are we sure this was the right call? And, sure enough, like, things worked out. I landed at a great venture firm in Light Bank that, really enabled me to pursue my thesis. But, it took 10 years to get there, or 7 years to get there. And, with that, I've been in venture and private equity investing for about 10 years now. But it definitely wasn't a straightforward journey. And I look at some of the folks at our team today who, got into venture when they were, right out of school. We have, one of the killers on our team, Simran. She's our climate product owner. She joined us right out of college. And I'm like, I don't know how, like, I was never as put together as she was when I was her age. So, we're all built a little bit differently, I guess.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel. Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's honestly, it may not seem like it to you, but I think it's pretty inspiring to hear people talk a little bit about like the difficulties, because usually it's just like, oh yeah, I'm a VC, right? Like come here, I'll debate if I want to invest in you and stuff like that, right? And it's just really great to hear the kind of the journey. I am curious though. You mentioned that your essentially your kind of a goal was to work in clean tech VC. How did you get into? Obviously, it was called clean tech before it was called ClimateTech, but how did you get interested in climate specifically?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, climate was something that, like, very much was important to me, like, even as a child. Like, I grew up on, like, bringing the UNICEF box to every house, like, that I could. Like, literally, I got grounded when I was like 8, because my parents couldn't find me because I was going door to door with, my UNICEF box to do that. And I'm ghosting on the name of whatever the environmental superhero was, but, like, that was like my lunchbox when I was like 6, 7 years old. And,
Yeah.
so, with that had always been part of it. And honestly, one of the big reasons why I went to, Richmond, was that they had this program around leadership studies, which was really about, how do you do well by doing good, and, kind of the nexus of, how you could be a leader or servant to society while also, having an actual career. And, my whole academic experience was really around environmental economics. Like, I wrote my, honors thesis on how environmental conditions in a country could be a leading indicator of economic progress rather than a lagging indicator, as it is in the US and so forth. And, that was a big focus of me, of how we could go and make sure concepts like sustainability and things like the Human Development Index, that we could focus on economic indicators beyond just GDP and so forth. And I was fortunate to work under some great professors who ultimately, several of them actually were, ultimately became professors at Columbia, both on the leadership and economics faculty. So, I guess I caught the right ones. But even in college, I was working on, microfinance in, in Latin America, internships with big Fortune 500 companies on sustainability. This has been something that was really pervasive in my career. And frankly, like, it had led a big role in my life. My wife is an extremely big sustainability person. She ran green buildings at NRDC for a bunch of years. Like, she was in the market advisory board for USGBC for a while. She's a chief impact officer of a real estate private equity fund right now. So, I think, like, climate is something that's hard not to be personal, if you honestly like care a ton about it. And, I was able, first 5 6 years of my career, to make that my career. Like, I joined Deloitte really principally because I was under the arm of a mentor who, said that he would really guide me to the ability to work on those type assignments, rather than had I gone to another firm or, joined a generalist program, I would have worked on a ton of other stuff that I wasn't
Hmm.
really interested in. And happened to be in DC back in 2007 through 2012, which might have been the most exciting, like, 5 years of, clean energy boom and bust cycle that we've had, leading up to this cycle. But certainly DC was the most exciting place in terms of
Hmm.
what was happening with the Recovery Act and what was happening in the loan guarantee program and all that. And, I was fortunate to have some exposure to that, on the client side, and, be able to do some work with the Department of Energy. And that was an exciting and thrilling place, and a lot of lessons learned to come out of that. But, I knew that climate was a big part of my career until it started to become a question whether climate could be part of my career.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
I interviewed with a venture capitalist, or a venture capital firm, and I remember this was probably 2010. So the clean tech bubble had already burst, and the recruiters that put me in touch said, "All right, just instead of saying clean tech, say high tech, like, on everything." So I remember scrubbing my resume and, like, removing, hey, did this project for this, like, high tech, startup in this space, or like this diligence assignment for this private equity firm focused on da da da, and all focused on, like, scrubbing it to make sure it wasn't like energy related, and that I just had work on all these novel technologies. And and none of it was lying, but it was just like, very much hiding the fact that it was energy, because after the clean tech bubble, you were unhireable. And, in venture
I
capital, if you
I
worked on.
really find the backlash against things, and this happens, I think, especially in Silicon Valley. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's other places too, but there's so much backlash against something that is like, oh man, that was terrible. Like we definitely got to sweep that under the rug, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of beta chasing out there, where, like, people will love to be on a bandwagon when it's rolling, and then, like, the first to jump off it when it's not. VCs in general are sheep, and the only way to get real returns is to break from that and be in the herd. But I'll say that that particular venture capital firm, as it kind of sussed out that they're like, okay, wait, like, so you're not a cloud guy, you're not like a IT infrastructure guy, you're not like this dude, like, what are you? I was like, um, most of these were in clean tech, and he just goes, ugh. That must be tough. Yeah. And, like, that was the end of the interview. It was like, okay, like, we can keep this going, but he's like, "Look, like, we're never hiring a clean tech person right now. So, like, nice guy, nice to meet you. You got to make a career change." And, be honest, like, I felt a lot of that. I mean, some of the last consulting assignments I was on, I was, running around foreign countries, and, doing work that I felt was incredibly impactful, and I really loved, doing it. But, as you think about starting a family and you're running around, places like Dhaka, Bangladesh 6 days before your wedding, and you start really questioning, okay, like, is this really like the career that I want to have? So, part of the rationalization was, my wife was going to continue on and focus on buildings, and that was going to be, how she did. And I was going to find my way into the investment world and hopefully come back to energy someday in a way that I could. But, I was very much at a point that I like been pigeonholed in my career and was finding my options extremely, extremely limited. So, I made this jump into, technology, private equity, and it was like anything that I could apply from my energy experience, I was trying to bolt it on. Like, it was like, okay, like industrial automation of like energy companies, or like oil field services, like an automation of that. Like, let's look at buyouts in these type of places. And we ended up doing stuff from financial services and so forth, a bunch of other categories. But, I kept on like trying to bring back my experiences from smart grid and clean tech and all this, kind of, I would say the energy sector was one of the first places with, pulling data from hardware devices. So it was very big on industrial IoT early on in this kind of industry 4.0, wave. And fortunately that opened up the doors to, what has ultimately become predominant thesis, here at Equal. But again, not an easy journey, and
Yeah.
you find a hard way to, like, if you're passionate enough about something, you'll eventually get there, but you might have to take a couple of detours along the way. So
Yeah, but I think it's also worth noting that there's so much value you learn. Like it's very hard to see that in a moment, yes, but throughout that journey, like there's so many things you experience that can really help inform you to become a better VC, right? Maybe you can comment. You mentioned you've got somebody who came straight from uni, who is killing it, right, and doing a great job. So obviously it depends on the situation, but there's obviously that value that you get from being in your career and seeing things differently, right?
yeah, look,
Um,
there's some, you and I were talking about books right before this, and I think there's like an incredible, like book called Napoleon's Glance, which is about, taking, different sectors of expertise and mashing them in. Like if you look at Google, it's like, two insights across two very different ends of the technology spectrum. Napoleon, in the reference of the book, was really, he was truly a historian before being a leader, and he would study battle maps endlessly. And this is the reason why Warren Buffett just is like constantly reading. He's constantly studying to see how is an insight from one thing, and how can you mash that up against an insight of another. There's a fabulous book called Range that's kind of about this like meshing of insights from generalists. And candidly, that's one of the reasons why, like, I love, like, we're a firm that invests, and I love energy, and energy is big passion, but like I love insurance too, and I love supply chain. And I think, these industries definitely have so many intersections. We're looking at climate insurance and a lot around that, and risk management and so forth. And that's, especially as it's related to building, very, very fascinating. You look at supply chain systems and how to make them more sustainable. Obviously, that's such a tremendous source, of emissions, like lots of implications, but the ability to pull insights across these markets and be able to say, wow, like something really interesting is happening here. I wonder if that would work in this sector as well. That I really do believe in cognitive diversity, and the fact that we have, a person on our team that focuses on insurance with 100% of their time, and, a person on our team that spends all 100% of their time on climate. Like, they're both in our office right now working on something together. And it's like, you have someone who was the COO of an insurance startup that's like raised 40 million bucks and been an insurance technology executive for a long time. And then you have like this uber passionate, like, climate person who's, 3-4 years out of school, who's just like absolutely crushed it for us. Yeah. And that diversity of thought, a very, very different experiences, like that friction creates fire in a very, very meaningful way. And that's actually like one of the core underpinnings of our firm, is that we wouldn't want to be a specialist in one sector because, like, maybe it's because I'm too ADD. But the ability to pull insights from these different sectors and apply that expertise, we do think it provides a unique advantage.
yeah, I do. That's a common thread that has happened with the VCs that seem to do well that I've had on the show. There's some outside insight, right? They're maybe experts in one particular thing, but they get extra insight from somewhere else, right? In order to make sure that they're not getting too narrowly focused. Because it's like the whole issue with legacy industries, which actually we'll talk about this in a second. They tend to just do things the way they've been done, right? Because that's how they are. Like there's certain people are in it, they do it the same way. Like I grew up with parents who, when they were growing up, were farmers, and a couple of my uncles and aunts were farmers, and they just do things the way they've done it, right? When somebody comes in and introduces a new idea, they're pretty skeptical usually. But let's actually get into this. So why don't we talk specifically about just kind of the history of you starting Equal Ventures and just kind of what you do specifically. Talk a little bit more about that. Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
Yeah. So when my very first angel investment was a company called Workrise, and that company is now worth $3 billion. It's in the energy space, and I was fortunate while I was at my prior firm to invest in invest in 10, 11 companies either through the fund and personally. Four of them have thus far become unicorns, and the uniting factor across all of them was a really, really bad seed stage experience for them raising capital. And partially it's because the product that venture capital is today is not a great product for founders in these legacy industries. If you're building the next version of Datadog, you can walk into any firm in Silicon Valley and speak to someone who's either built versions or iterations of product in that category or invested in other ones. They know your competitive landscape, they know your customers, they know your M&A buyers, they can introduce you to top flight recruits because they know the culture of companies like that, and that ultimately is like a pretty solid experience. Like, if I were building the next version of Datadog, I know that I could go to 25, 30, 50, venture capital firms that could actually provide real value to my company. And we think that's like, it's because they have a prepared mind in that category. Meanwhile, as I was looking at companies like ClearCover or Project 44 or, Rig Up Now Workrise, so many of the interactions that they had with other venture capitalists were, all right, like, well, here's how I would do this in this industry. And they're like, well, our industry doesn't work like that. Or, you're spending the first 40 minutes of that conversation explaining the 101 of this. And by the way, at that time, vertical software was nowhere near as perceived interesting as it is now, and certainly there's been a lot of things to come to be since then. Viva was still not a public company at that point, but over the course of that interaction, they would work with a VC who didn't understand their customers, didn't understand their market, had difficulty with bits and atoms, let alone electrons, didn't know their M&A buyers, and then broadly gave advice that was relevant to an IT company or a consumer product that had nothing to do, with the industry that they operated in. So that inherently would have the potential lead to conflict. And, this was something that I saw across a lot of the companies that I worked with, that at the seed stage, before the data was there, it was incredibly hard for all of those companies to raise capital. Now, once there was data behind them, they could actually talk to customers that were customers of the company rather than from their warm network. The companies were off to the races. At that point, you could see in the data that these companies were going to be wildly successful. But it was that really initial stage. And I found myself asking how many companies never got that first check, how many companies, that, I had the chance to be a part of, would not have existed had there hadn't been someone to take that leap. And with that, Equal started with a very simple premise. How do we provide founders of businesses and places like energy, supply chain, insurance with the same product that other founders in IT, consumer, and other places, have been given for years? And that seemed a little contrarian at the time that we did it. That it needed something that actually had that prepared mind. But I think over the course of our first fund, it's been something that we've been able to prove out that founders do want and need, VCs who can leap before the data in some of these sectors, by bringing a prepared mind and appreciation for those sectors.
So this is really fascinating. So there's a couple of things. One thing you mentioned before and one just now. All of the biggest mistakes that I've heard founders talk about on here have been usually a lack of market knowledge or understanding. And what you're saying is that the VCs have essentially that built in. They understand how the market works and they can give it guidance, right? This is the thing you mentioned before, which is you were interested in the idea of consulting with an equity stake, right? That's how you describe VC, which is I've never heard anybody describe it like, because that is not what I think most people view
Yeah,
VC as
I'm not a
today.
banker at the end of the day. Like, I think I'm
Yeah.
with the checkbook, and I think like I felt I was really terrible at private equity. Like I looked at my classmates at CBS, and there was a guy from KKR and another guy from Clinton Dubier and Rice, another guy from Appaloosa. I'm like, man, I am really dumb in finance compared to these folks. But then, when I found myself against the guys from McKinsey or BCG or Banner, it was like, you know what? Like I'm way better at these guys. Like, and I had the chance to work on some really cool assignments at Deloitte. I had incredible mentors. Like one of my mentors is now global head of the energy practice. So like I've gotten to work for the two global heads of the energy practice, in a row, Chris Nicholson and then Stanley Porter, and my my other mentor is now CEO of Deloitte Consulting, like in the US, like manages 45,000 employees. I got lucky that I worked with some incredible people there, but I've always felt myself as a consultant solving problems and helping people think through problems rather than a banker, analyzing financial statements and trying to put as much leverage on a model. So
Yeah, but it's so interesting that when you said that, I wrote that, I was like, this is cool. I gotta write this down because I've never heard anybody talk about VC being that way. That's always how I looked at it because I'm trying to ask VCs like, hey, what are you doing to help leverage, gain leverage for your portfolio companies, for example. So maybe you have
every firm's
any
going to do this differently. Like, our model is one. Like, I find like firms like Union Square Ventures and Emergence Capital operate with
Mhm.
like a consultant, like like guidance
Yeah.
and very concentrated mentality. And there's other highly successful firms that are asset management oriented. That are like, this is about deploying capital and making sure we 2 to 3x capital. And look, a lot of those firms have made way more money than we will make, but like it is a personal preference for mine that like I love spending my time working with portfolio companies, helping them figure out thorny issues, like running. We do a lot of strategy work and a bunch of very nerdy research, for our companies, and like that's because it's the thing that I enjoy. It's probably not the best way to make money, but it's the only way that we know how to make money here. So
But it's also especially relevant because if you're trying to build, so in the circumstance we're talking about, which is climate, we're trying to solve decarbonization for lots of different spaces. And these are spaces that need to be decarbonized, but there's not an existing infrastructure. So I would be curious if you have a framework for maybe you want to break down for us which legacy industries you focus on. And you kind of mentioned it before, but maybe break down it a little bit more in detail, but explain how do you build out that, let's say, ecosystem or data set, whatever you want to call it, to help those founders to make good decisions and to know, okay, this founder has the right things. We just have to help them take it from A to B.
yeah. So our firm is broken up into four segments, and that's commerce enablement. And we'll say like that is everything non-e-commerce related. Like we are 100% focused on like, wholesale and, brick and mortar and the back end gook of the industry, because we feel like that's been like the area that Silicon Valley has ignored, despite it being a much larger source of the economics. We'll put that to a side for a second. Insurance, which is been a big area. I worked in Chicago. I knew nothing about insurance before I came to Chicago. And then, you're in kind of the breadbasket plays where you have Willis Tower CNA building. And first board of a company I was ever put on was in the insurance space. And it's been, remarkably similar. When you look at energy markets, insurance markets, black swan risk is a very real thing. Supply chain has been an area that across a lot of stuff in energy, there's been intersection. And, we've been particularly involved in freight markets there, as well as, logistics. And we find that a very interesting. And then the fourth is energy. And for energy for us, yes, there are some sustainability considerations, but I'd say the predominant focus for us is really on the power and utility sector. So like building electrification, how do we think about digital transformation of the grid? How do we think about ways to advance adoption of clean energy renewables via software, either marketplaces or in platforms? And, for us, we verticalize our team. Again, we have an expert in each, but we perform, but really the root of everything is this like kind of prepared mind rules all mantra that we have, that we do biweekly research briefings as a team, that all of us are responsible for kind of constantly going and meeting, experts in the space, ideating, like taking all this research, much like a hedge fund or a research analyst, Wall Street research, firm would do. Like we take several hundred pages of content, like have it summarized across us, and like use that to have really, deep discussions about what's happening in industry and what we're seeing and what we're hearing from experts, and developing really authentic, relationships with those sources, whether it's public company CEOs or anyone else covering the space, or founders that we like and respect, or journals and articles that we're reading and using that. All that leads to kind of our ideation phase, that we might say, hey, look, it doesn't make sense to me that I'm seeing building systems produce such incredible ROI, but the reality is no one's adopting them. Like, why is that the case? What, like, if there's this big, massive, like, movement towards like real-time energy management systems for building and all these savings, like, why hasn't this worked? And then we'll go and pull that thread a little bit, and we'll actually take that to, after discussing and voting on it as a team, like, is this an idea that we want to consider, like, doing further research on? We will go and actually do like a tremendous deep dive on that. And that might be speaking to 25 or 30, building owners in the space, assess their willingness to pay, for building systems, and looking at a bunch of reasons why and why not. I mean, going through very much the customer discovery that a founder should be going through, and hopefully the founders that we work with do, to identify why the existing status quo hasn't worked and whether there's a path forward to making that work. And then we'll develop a thesis, around that of, in that case, it was counter positioning for clean energy buildings. We realized that there was, roughly a 6 to 7x value creation for buying these systems versus what people were willing to pay for them, and felt that there's an opportunity to frankly give the software away for free, to go and actually take a percentage of shared savings. So we'll go and use that process and speak to a ton of customers and say, hey, like, if we brought you a company that did this, like, would you be a buyer? And sure enough, we'll use our network to do that. And we like to think of ourselves as consultants to those partners. And instead of saying like, hey, go hire McKinsey, like, why don't you use us as a third party resource to go and look at a bunch of cool stuff for you, and say, we'll send you the stuff that we think is best. And we've developed a really collaborative relationship with a lot of folks in industry doing that, and just saying, hey, like, we'll send you the stuff that's interesting to us. And we don't make it transactional, and we don't treat it like it's a GLG call. Like, those are folks that we grab dinner and beers with, and we view as an extension of the fund. We call them bridgers. And if it's an idea that we feel really carries weight, like, we'll go out and find it. And in some cases, we've met like 70, 80 companies adjacent to that category. We'll pivot companies and say like, hey, you're a SaaS play right now. Maybe try giving this away for free, and speak to a bunch of customers that we know. In some cases, we'll start the company. I've started 4 or 5 companies during my career, and they've raised in the neighborhood of like 200 million bucks. And I love being on that day zero, the journey. But we do find that process circular. That, like, even if an idea sucks and we decide that we're not going to pursue it, the whole process of like really showing our passion and depth in these categories just makes us like smarter on the category. It unveils other opportunities, and it gets us deeper with these bridgers that, like, at the end of the day, they just want to see someone who's passionate about the stuff that they work with. Where, if you're someone who manages, tens of billions of dollars of building assets and spends hundreds of millions of dollars on energy, and you get to talk to someone who's like in our chair and is like, hey, I'm as fired up about this, and like, I couldn't be more excited to talk to you. Like, a lot of those folks don't get treated that way by traditional VC. There have been people who manage hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of energy spend who are like, hey, you know what? You're the first VC that's ever reached out to me. I was like, yeah, I don't know why other people don't do our model, but like, that's great to hear, and I'm here. So at the end of the day, like, all those ideas make it up to our big board of like, these are the businesses we would start if we were founders ourselves, and that is our mission. That we go out and find the businesses that if I were a founder, I would start today, and we find that lasering in and focusing on that makes it able so that we can focus on like, what are the ideas that we think are like the best ideas in the world in these sectors, rather than doing a bunch of deals that are doable. Like, we're not in the camp of doing deals that we like, we're in the camp of doing deals that we love.
Mhm. So just to clarify this, if I'm not mistaken, in almost every case, you will do the research and have like a thesis, and then you do this deep research, and then you go find the startups, not the other way around where they come to you and then you're like, well, let's do a research, and then you come back to them. Because I'm assuming that research process takes a second.
Oh yeah. Generally speaking, we're like coming up with an idea like probably 1 to 2 years before we actually like fund a company there.
Got
So
it.
the latest investment that I made, I think we published our thesis 2 years ago. And like, I've looked at 18 companies in the category. Honestly, we hadn't found one that we loved. I started like pitching the idea to some of the most amazing product people, that, I knew, and we found someone that I think is like a truly world class, CEO. And him and I went on a bunch of those early design partner calls. And I said, all right, let me prove to you, I'll be your first head of biz dev. And like we went and like secured a bunch of design partners. Like he recruited a ton of amazing people, and now we're off to the races. And I love that. Like being involved day zero in a company like that is, so incredibly fun. I mean, we took our kids to the baseball game, our Yankees game this weekend, and that, that feels like, amazing feeling to be there. Wow. Like we're at the start of something huge. So, it's not always that we're day zero. There's been plenty of cases where, 3Flow, one of our, company in the insurance space, like one of our best performing companies, it was a SaaS model. Like it had been around for 4 or 5 years. We showed them a bunch of research and pivoted into the current business model, and it's been off in the races since. Emergence led their Series A, Excel led their Series B. Company's killing it. But we do think that bringing that prepared mind and saying, hey, this is an idea that we think is amazing. You're either doing it or you're one step away from it, or we think that you would be an amazing CEO to do this. And being able to lock in with a CEO, or a founding team, and say that, like, we are so insanely passionate about this topic. I'm not a particularly smart person. Like I'm not a particularly sociable person, but if you have this immensely small island, that it's like, okay, I really want to talk about energy APIs. Like let's go and have a 4-hour conversation about energy APIs, and that I know, like, the ins and out of it and so forth. Like I can seem smart for that conversation. Give me in a bunch of other conversations, I'm going to seem like an idiot. But hopefully, I believe our founders, they appreciate those conversations. Say like, wow, like this guy cannot shut up. Like he's so insanely passionate about this, and he's knowledgeable about it. And I think that this could be a partner for a business, opposed to someone who's like read a research report, maybe one of our research reports, and says that they have a thesis in the space.
Yeah. One one really quickly I'd like to go over a question is around if you're putting you mentioned you put out the thesis. So do you do this all publicly? And if you do so, like why do you put it out publicly? Are you not afraid of people taking it? Because a lot of people would have that mentality.
Yeah. So at the beginning of our fund, we didn't publish them publicly, and then I would find that, and it was very much for that concern. I think over the course of our fund, we have actually progressively leaked a lot more of ours. So you can see some of that we've already done in the clean tech space. So we partnered with ClimateTech VC to publish our thesis on clean energy business in a box, like realizing that there was a similar element to what we just discussed in buildings, that really the long tail of solar and clean energy development companies, which is where the vast majority of market share is. Clean energy development is a very localized game. Were unwilling or unable to afford modern software systems, and that there was a really irrational willingness to pay because they have high turnover, high seasonality. So we basically came up with the idea to say, all right, what if we gave the software away for free and made money via working capital, procurement, a bunch of other business models that we think are novel, that we've seen work in other places like commerce or
Mm-hmm.
supply chain. We went out and looked at a ton of companies in that space, and then we were incredibly fortunate that we were able to engage with the founder, who wasn't even raising, was profitable at the time that they met us, bootstrapped their way to already an amazing business, and like read our report, and they were like, this is exactly what my business does. Like, have you heard about us? And it turns out they were focused on emerging markets, not the US. And I had done a bunch of emerging markets infrastructure work earlier in my career, so it clicked for me. But I think a lot of people missed it because of that. And
Mm-hmm.
that company's been fantastic since. It's Odyssey Energy Solutions. Emily, the CEO, is incredible. We led the seed round. Union Square Ventures led, the Series A, and what was an incredibly competitive financing. And we love that. We published our thesis on energy APIs, and our Plaid for Energy, or Project 44 for energy, with CTVC similarly. And I think, like, the combined views of those blog posts and research reports that we had published in them is like a couple 100,000. So, and we're gearing up to make an investment in that space. So, I think we are getting, if folks follow us on Substack or Medium or look to our website, we do publish more and more of this research. Sometimes you have to go through it to look through, you got to read the blog post to get to the deck, but we do publish a lot of our research more progressively.
Hmm.
And since we do think it's a great way to, one, educate the market, two, like candidly, like plant our flag. So like one of our other
Yeah.
things is in insurance. Like we've been looking at it all this space for a very long time. And a company that's one of the top companies in our pipeline is out raising right now. I've received 11 emails about this company over the last 3 days because like they're meeting with a bunch of VCs and folks are being like, so like, are you guys doing this one? And again, with me, like, I'm not going to tell them our opinion about it, but like, they should hopefully be looking to us for a signal. Whereas like when I came up in venture, I was looking for a signal from anyone else that I could get. And, I think now because we've had this prepared mind point of view and this mindset on really digging in on this problem set and establishing a bunch of customers, people aren't going to come to us for crypto or DevOps or social or whatever. If you're coming to me for any of that, you're probably, barking up the wrong tree. But if you want to learn about energy APIs, like I may be your guy.
Yeah. One other thing, just to clarify on this part. So maybe it's the reverse usually because you're looking for certain companies, but what stage and check size and focus areas would you just state for people who are interested and who are raising? Should they come to you or should they not?
Yeah. So all this is public information. I'm announcing on other things, but like our first fund, we didn't invest it north of a 20 post. So like we are early stage investors. Like we believe that this is a partnership. We did not invest and we do not own less than 10% of a company at entry point. So, historically our check sizes have been 1 to 2 million. Now we're writing checks a little bit larger than that. But we are early investors. We do not care whether you have a product or not. We've invested pre-revenue just as frequently as we've invested, post-revenue. It really depends on the company and what we think is their proximity to product market fit. And for us, really, we'll do anything that's a digital business, and that can be a technology-enabled service. It can be a SaaS company. It could be, a marketplace. It could be a platform business. What we're really looking for is the ability for that company to monopolize a point of the value chain. And that generally requires them to have like a really strong flywheel around the business. And we want to know that, the team can build a category leading company in that space. And, I'm a big strategy nerd, as we were talking about books. Like we've developed a lot of our own kind of proprietary frameworks, around, value creation and how to monopolize. And we very much obsess over how can a company not participate and perform well in a category, but like if all goes according to plan, like which nothing ever does, but if it all goes according to plan, like can these folks monopolize the category? And I think that's so important in a sector like energy, which is selling commodities, most of the time, and there's lots of regional specialization and lots of fragmentation. But if you can develop a monopoly business in a sector as large as energy, or for that matter, insurance or supply chain or commerce, you are looking at the biggest scale outcomes out there. So, I think like, we've been fortunate to have some, great companies start to break out in fund one, but like it's impossible to tell which is going to be the biggest company. But if a single one of them figures out how to monopolize their portion of the value chain, the scale of outcomes should be tens of billions, not billions.
Mhm. Okay, very cool. I love that. I think thanks for the transparency. I really appreciate that. I want to be conscious of time here, but I want to go and ask kind of one general question about um the ClimateTech VC half one 2023 report on funding. My biggest question is just to get your kind of gut reaction or thoughts on why we're seeing fewer fewer late stage fundings and more early stage fundings. I want to understand if you have an idea around why that trend is happening.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. So one, this is broadly happening across like venture in general. There's some research that we put out there around like, alpha versus beta. That I gave to our LPs, back in May. around what we were seeing with funding trends as later stage VCs were moving much earlier in the capital spectrum as they were trying to make their fund cycles last longer. Candidly, there's never been a less attractive time to be a seed investor. Historically, the premium of a late stage valuation to an early stage valuation has been about 20 to 25 times. So like think of that as like early stage valuation 10 million, late stage valuation 200, 250 million. In 2021, that hit 42 times. So $10 million valuation, 420 million. Oh, big climb. In the first half of 2023, it was 9.6. So like literally 75% less attractive to be a seed stage investor. And you're talking about all the risk, all the dilution, all the failure that you could take along the way all the time. Like it was because everyone was moving earlier. The price of seed stage went up, competition at seed stage went up, and growth was all of a sudden everyone who had been paying, doing 20 deals a year at 100 times, ARR was all of a sudden alligator arms. So that is happening broadly across the venture space. The second part of this is companies in climate tech, most of them don't have product market fit. Like, and this is like, there's been a flood of capital into this market. A lot of people are interested in it. Like we have a very cynical point of view on it for what it's worth, that like there's a lot of people who understand energy and there's a lot of people who understand, how to build companies. Building companies in energy is a different thing. And we think that there's a far smaller universe of folks who know how to do that. Our hope is that we're one of those folks. We've yet to prove that out, but hopeful that we can. But as we've looked at the universe of companies, there's a lot of team and TAM. A lot of people are excited about companies and spaces and a lot of very exciting teams attacking broadly macro-oriented, like exciting things. Very, very few companies have meaningful traction. We're fortunate to be in a couple that actually do have meaningful traction and have been able to progress and raise follow-on rounds. But very, very few companies are beyond a couple million of revenue, if that. And I think that's the reason why late stage financings are starting to fall off a cliff. There's more pressure on some of the hard tech and frontier tech stuff in an environment where, capital markets are less certain because, you do need to kind of start leaning on what are the companies that are going to show revenue, cash flow, and so forth in the future. So I think the reality is like, that's likely going to continue to happen. We're also seeing a massive pullback in the LP side. There's still more interest in climate than there is in, other broader areas of tech. I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of interest in solving for climate across different asset classes, whether that's real assets, private equity, or venture, and being part of the energy transition. But a pullback nonetheless that's afflicting the broader, LPGP dynamic.
Okay, that's helpful. I really appreciate that. That's a helpful. I think that's a very helpful insight. So for the last section here, I want to just shift a little bit and let's talk about general advice for other founders or VCs. So let's start with probably, in order to make this kind of climate tech revolution happen, there's a lot of other, VCs that need to make good decisions. So what specifically is your advice? And we maybe sort of talked about this in some ways, but just to get a little bit deeper on it, what is your advice to other VCs from your experience on how to make the right decisions on which companies to invest in? Because there is obviously opportunity cost, right? Hey there, that's the end of the free portion of this episode. If you'd like to hear the rest, you can do so by becoming a paid subscriber of the show. This helps us to continue improving the show and the ecosystem around it. To become a paid subscriber, you can go to cleantechies.substack.com/subscribe, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can do so by tapping the subscribe button on our show's page. Thank you for being a supporter of the show.